Jake Paul defeated Nate Diaz via unanimous decision after 10 rounds of boxing and some fooling about, but mostly boxing. The house was packed, the gate was 3 M's plus, and not a bad night for these two combat sports superstars overall. Remember, they were also promoters here. Mike, you were there live in the house. You're going to lead off with the first take. Bring it, baby.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the big positive here is we could be sitting here on this Monday having a much sadder conversation when it comes to Nate Diaz. I think he didn't have too bad of a account of himself. I think a lot of us coming in thought this might end ugly for him, and it seemed like in that first round, certainly wasn't the best start for him. He gets knocked down in the fifth, and you're just like, oh no, is this gonna be that kind of night? Didn't end up really being. He came back, had his moments. I'm sure we'll talk about like the late guillotine attempt and all that stuff. He made it fun at least. Did that thing where he loses the fight, but I think still comes out smelling like flowers to a degree. So I don't think all in all a bad night on the Nate Diaz side. And then if you're Jake Paul, rebounds from his first loss, right? I think he showed improvement from what we've seen out of him in previous fights. Arguably his most complete and best boxing performance. You can say whatever you want about how maybe the opponent is related to that. Once again, an older, aging MMA fighter and not a person who came from a professional boxing upbringing. So, of course, there's the same old criticisms to be had about Jake Paul as there probably could be for a long time now if you're one of the people who dislikes the opponent selection for him. But this felt like a big event, man. When I was there, the crowd was unreal. There was a lot of good energy in there. The undercard was pretty underwhelming, but I think these two overall saved the day and made it a fun night at the end of it. So, it felt like a strong event watching from ringside. I'd be curious to know how everyone kind of felt like watching from home, because obviously there's a UFC event going on as well. Worked out well for them, and the fact that Corey Sandhagen's fight ended right before the main event started. So all in all, I think a good night for combat sports, but being there on the ground in Dallas, it felt like a big deal.
All right. So Mike, your last MMA pay-per-view was, I should say UFC, was Utah, right?
Yeah, just the week prior.
So compare the atmosphere there to that event. Not fight night, obviously, because you can't be in two places at once. Right. And I think it's more comparable to go boxing fight night versus the pay-per-view. So since it was the most recent, what was the vibe like? All that stuff.
Definitely a different type of crowd, right? At the Jake Paul fight, you have pretty much everything you could imagine. You have little kids there with their parents. You have, girls there dressed up to the nines and the nice dresses and stuff. And it's just kind of a very much mixed blend of all sorts of people. You had, Nate Diaz had a lot of support there. You could definitely tell like the California crew came out. So there was like some people there that maybe you could describe as slightly sketchy characters, being like, if something pops off here, like it could get ugly in this arena. Thankfully, nothing crazy happened. I think the worst we got was maybe a little brawl in the hallway after the event between some fans. That video is being kind of circulating around. But the UFC crowd was more or less typical, I guess. But how could that not be a hot crowd, right? Like that UFC 291 card was absolutely unreal from top to bottom, had some incredible finishes and stuff. So the energy from that one was great from start to finish. The boxing fight was, like I said, kind of underwhelming. The undercard fights up until the main event. Ashton Silva had a nice knockout to open the official main card. Some prelims got bumped up, but yeah, that was more or less the highlight until we got to Jake Paul and Nate Diaz.
Yeah, the main event is where it's all at in boxing. All right, so Fada Hanoun, you're next. What did you think of this event? I don't even think I need to ask for your guys' scores. I think everybody kind of had Jake Paul winning, but how did Nate Diaz come off to you? How did the event come off to you?
It was fun. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fight. I thought, the biggest win for Jake Paul is probably knocking Nate Diaz down. I thought he was going to win by decision. Didn't expect him to knock him down. So I was impressed by that. But it was fun. I mean, typical Nate Diaz antics. He came on strong towards the end, finished it off with his guillotine, putting his arms up. It was fun. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good rebound for Jake Paul because obviously coming off of the Tommy Fury loss, the first real boxer that he fights. But then again, at least Nate Diaz was one of those MMA guys that boxes. He's known for his boxing in MMA. So at least it was that not so much like a Ben Askren where people were kind of completely critiquing the matchup itself. But so yeah, I thought it was fun. Diaz had his moments towards the end. My only issue is sometimes when these MMA guys, I don't know where to point in terms of Diaz's career. I think it's fair to say it could be the latter part of his career. He seems, to be talking about a return to UFC, talking about MMA with Jake Paul. I know we'll get to that later. But it kind of does hurt your stock a little bit sometimes when you do those fights. Because when I think of Nate Diaz, if he were to return to the UFC, we're thinking what potentially Dustin Poirier and stuff. And then after that fight with Jake Paul getting knocked down in round 5, I feel like in a way your stock almost drops. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more later on. But overall, I enjoyed it. I thought Diaz, came on strong later. That kind of saved his performance a little bit. Knockdown didn't help at all. But overall, Jake Paul looked solid. And I was entertained. So I liked it.
And even Nate's last fight in the UFC versus Ferguson, it wasn't really a banger per se. But yeah, because what awaits Nate apparently is, or we would think, the big fight is Conor McGregor, who we'll get to in a second. But he's yet to even enter the USADA pool. I don't know how many times I said that. All right, how about Nolan? Let's go to you. Your take on the fight, the event, man. What do you think? Do you even want to see them run it back? There's, like Fada said, there's so many options for all these guys.
No, I don't have any interest in a rematch, but I think that was fun for what it was, right? I mean, we saw all week there were a lot of people that seemed to not necessarily like the idea that this was being involved in our coverage, and there was a lot of trash talk about that. But to me, man, I don't understand why this product can't coexist with everything else we've got going on. I mean, obviously there is an audience for it. Just watching that moment, I felt that it was a lot of fun. I'm not a guy that necessarily delves into the influencer boxing game by any means, but it was cool. I mean, it is what it is. I don't think anybody is sitting here saying like that's the greatest boxing match we've ever seen, or either of these guys are necessarily particularly fantastic at boxing, but I think it was fun for what it was. I think that fight week seemed to take it from a level that, in terms of interest in it, that like when we entered the week, I was like, man, this is this week. I feel like nobody's talking about it. And then as it went on, it seemed like they did, whatever happened. I don't know if it was maybe the press conference thing where there was the shoving between security guards, or just maybe people's general recognition that like, oh, this is happening this weekend. But it seemed like their ticket sales went way up. It seemed, excuse me, that people in general were talking about it a lot more, and it just felt like a bigger event once it got there. So like Mike said, the crowd was great. Excuse me. It just seemed like a big event. So I was pretty happy with it. I was pretty entertained by it. And but I just don't have any interest in a rematch, man. That was pretty one-sided. I don't really know what else is out there for Jake Paul from here on out. Maybe that's something we'll touch on in a minute, but I think for what it was a fun moment in time, and I think it should be respected for that.
Nolan, to be exact here, you don't want to see them rematch in boxing. What about this whole deal about he'll come over to MMA, 10 million, whether it's in the PFL, whether it's PFL and Real co-promoting? We know Jake's not going to go to the UFC, or at least I don't think that's even possible. But what do you think in MMA?
The appeal is really not there as much as it is. I know everybody always says, well, the boxers never come over to MMA. To me, it's that is not as appealing to me. Like, I would watch it. I think it would be obviously entertaining for different reasons, for kind of the wrong reasons, because I just think it would be way more lopsided than it would be the other Nate going to boxing. Like, I think when you have a guy that's done decades worth of jiu-jitsu and has the submission skills, I mean, it really only takes one takedown. We've seen a couple times where boxers have come over to MMA on the lower levels and it hasn't ended up well for them, except for Ray Mercer, who knocked out Tim Sylvia. So I guess there is always that puncher's chance. But yeah, man, I don't really have that much interest in that. I think there's things I'd rather see Diaz do from here on out. I mean, since I've worked here, we've talked about the Conor McGregor trilogy. So that's something that I still feel like needs to happen. And then also just, I think the fact that he is interested in going back to the UFC, like this, does he really want to go to PFL and do this? I don't know. I mean, it's hard to get a gauge with him, but I'm not really interested in the rematch, to be honest with you, in any combat sport.
All right. Fada, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, because I was talking about the whole Diaz's stock potentially dropping a little bit. I think I saw some odds floating around where he was a minus 1,200 favorite, and you would think before this boxing match he would have been a much larger favorite, considering that Jake Paul has never done MMA. So that was kind of the point that I was getting at. I would have, we've seen larger favorites in MMA fights from top contenders fighting champions, and Diaz being a minus 1,200 favorite over Jake Paul. I expected it to be much, much larger, but I think people are looking at the boxing match and thinking that they could see something out of Jake Paul, that we don't know anything of what he would look like in an MMA cage, considering obviously he's never competed in MMA. So that was kind of where I was getting at with his stock dropping a little bit, because minus 1,200, I expected the odds to be way, way bigger than that. But it seems like, right after the boxing match, people seem to think Jake has a chance against Diaz. At least those odds are not the odds we'd usually see over a seasoned MMA guy like Nate Diaz, a former title challenger, versus a guy who's never competed in MMA.
Did they not see the street fight in New Orleans? Because I think it would go like that personally. But
maybe he just found that guillotine. I don't know. Am I the only one who's excited, I guess, for the potential of that? I'm not convinced that Nate Diaz would try to take him down or submit him. I feel like he would almost try to stand with him in MMA and prove a point. And maybe, the knees and the kicks and the clinch work and the pushing against the fence without being separated might be enough for him to win a fight without doing that. But I mean, it's not like Nate Diaz has the greatest takedown game in the world. I guess he could pull guard or something, but if Jake Paul, he did wrestle a little bit in high school, if he dedicated himself to 6 months of sprawl training, as they used to say for anyone who came over, maybe he could do enough against Nate to make it competitive, and maybe Nate would be willing to stand up, because that's how he'd like to prove a point and win, and maybe say, I can beat you in stand up in MMA like you beat me in stand up in boxing. I don't know. I feel like it's maybe more competitive. It just depends on how goofy Jake Paul might look out there trying to throw kicks and stuff, or what his stand up would look like in an MMA fight.
See, if this fight happens, and go for it, Farah.
No, go for it. I was just going to say, do you guys think minus 1,200 is fair? Like, is that how you would put it? Like the odds?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. That seems okay to me. Like, it's hard to tell with Nate at this point, right? And who knows? An MMA fight, he gets cut up. There's a chance of like a cut stoppage, things like that. Who knows with him? That seems appropriate to me. I guess you could do it higher, and maybe it gets bet up higher if that's actually the line, but it doesn't seem outrageous.
Yeah, for me, once you start getting in odds that are so lopsided, I feel like I don't even know what the difference between a 20-1 favorite or a 24-1 favorite is. You know what I mean? It's so unlikely to happen that I think, honestly, I would probably even have it bigger, I guess, if I had to choose. But I don't know. See, here's the thing, right? Mike just said that. If he's right, he's got his clip. If this fight happens and Jake Paul wins, he's got his clip. But if it doesn't happen, nobody's going to remember they just said that. So, except me. I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to find this.
It's funny because as Mike was talking, I remember what I was feeling on Saturday night. Under the influence of Modelo's, I get it. But still, I was on the edge of my seat. Like, first of all, I was expecting this fight to play out, right? I knew that Jake Paul would be tough early on and Nate, later as it went. Yeah. But all of a sudden, Jake Paul really hurt this guy. In round one, he's coming after him. I'm like, oh my God, this is going to be embarrassing for us MMA guys, because I thought he would last a little longer. And then Nate weathers that storm. And then I keep thinking, okay, start to turn it on. And then he gets knocked down. I'm like, holy cow, what is going on here? And then, of course, those other rounds. See, I thought it was closer than whatever it was, 99, 92 or whatever. I thought it was a little closer. I thought Nate was kind of taking off the beginning of the rounds, like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all those. And then coming on so strong that you felt like if he had just done that 30 seconds or 45 seconds earlier in the round, instead of waiting to halfway, he maybe could put Jake Paul away, because Jake Paul was kind of like, on his heels and going backwards. I don't know. I had a buddy that was watching with me, and he goes, this is garbage boxing. I'm like, stop focusing on that. No one's trying to compare this to Crawford and Spence, right? What we're saying, though, is if you pick two personalities that you want to see fight, and someone's got to eat crow and someone gets all the roses, that's interesting. And so that's how I felt about it. So the rematch, part of me wants to see him come over because, I'd like to see MMA guys win fights, because I think we have the baddest athletes in the world. And unfortunately, we always have to take our beatings in boxing. So part of me does want to see it. The only problem is I just don't know if it'll have that big spotlight that it would, obviously, under the UFC banner, and we know that can happen. Mike, let me ask you this. Let me take you through fight week. Was it like Nolan said, where this thing snuck up on us? It kind of did seem a little dead, and then all of a sudden that shoving, the pushing around on stage seemed to really, really take it to to that level of what we felt like it should be. Is that kind of how you felt the vibe over there as well? I should stop using the word vibe. That one's getting old.
For sure. It was a little dull leading up to that point, but I think we all knew on the ground there, like at some point, something is going to pop off here and something's going to happen. We just didn't know what it would look like, who would be in between. Like, dude, Nate Diaz had like 80 people there with him. He had so many people in the hotel. They had an Airbnb that like all the boys were there. I spoke with his manager, Zach Rosenfield, and he's like, man, we're probably not going to see that Airbnb damage deposit back that we put down, right? Like they just knew they were rolling deep and it was going to be chaotic. And Jake Paul, as always, had a huge crew as well. So you had a feeling something was going to happen eventually. And you could see how happy Jake Paul was on the stage when that little press conference scuffle happened. He was just like, finally, like a gift from the gods here. Mm-hmm. And it kind of took it a little bit over the edge. And then I thought their final face-off at the public ceremonial weigh-ins, whatever you want to call it. They don't like that you call it ceremonial weigh-ins in boxing. They want it to be called the public weigh-in. But anyways, I thought that face-off was great between them. Chael Sonnen appears. Nate throws the little kick. And I think that really just kind of elevated it a bit there. So, yeah, it was a bit of a slow start. And it's hard, as you say, like you have Crawford Spence the week before. You have that huge UFC pay-per-view. It's hard to kind of etch your spot in this combat sport space out now just because there's everything happening every single weekend. And it did sneak up on us a little bit. But I think by the time it arrived, it was good. ESPN Plus jumping on board as a pay-per-view distributor at like the 11th hour a little bit was a big deal. They promoted this thing 10 times what DAZN did. It felt like, at one point, like Mark Raimondi, our colleague from ESPN, it was just going to be him there covering the event. And then when ESPN Plus picked it up, they send out, cameramen and all that stuff to make their coverage even more thorough. So by the time we arrived there, it did feel like a big deal to me.
Okay. A few other things here. But first of all, shout out to Taupa from New Zealand tuning in. And yes, folks, we did go an hour early, not just this week, but for the next couple months, we're going to do an 11 a.m. Eastern start time, 8 a.m. Pacific to accommodate the Dana White Contender Series weigh-ins. We'll throw it to that as this show's ending. It's an hour show every Monday. So welcome to those of you that maybe caught this early. And, hey, leave a like and a subscribe so that you can be reminded of when we're on. I think you hit that little bell and boom, it tells you when this channel is on live. And trust me, folks, we have a lot of great content. Again, following us after this will be the Dana White Contender Series. But them likes are the key. So please hit that for us. And I'm going to try and get to some of these comments and questions. A shout out to Chill Winston. Benyam Gretschall or something like that says, what are the odds each of you would put on an MMA fight between Jake and Diaz? You might have missed it, Benyam, but Afada said, Potter, you said you saw an official minus 1,200. Was that
I saw that floating around, and shout out to him. He kind of kickstarted that conversation, so he put that comment that's why I brought it up. But yeah, I saw that floating around quite a bit. I'm not sure who it came from, but it was the same odds that I kept seeing around those minus 1,200. That could have changed, but yeah, I mean, like I said, it's because it's coming right off the boxing match. I think they would have been a lot different before they boxed, but maybe a bit of recency bias. But hey. There's the big question mark and the unknown with Jake Paul. I know he does have a bit of a wrestling background, but the cardio, he looked like he was starting to slow down towards the end. And MMA, you've got clinch, you've got grappling. It's a whole different ball game. So,
but Diaz is so stubborn, man. And the longer you throw with 4-ounce gloves, you just never know. And because I think that's what Tim Sylvia was thinking. As this fight plays out, I'm going to catch Ray Mercer with something, that he's not used to. And the thing was over like in 16 seconds. Chill Winston says, I thought Jake Paul made huge improvements from the Tommy Fury fight. He looked powerful and accurate. Would love to hear how much you guys think he improved in such a short time. Anybody want to weigh in on that one? Has anybody been tracking Jake Paul's boxing career? I have, but you guys are the stars.
I think he improved. I kind of said it earlier, right? I thought he was a better version of himself. He changed a lot of things within his training and his camp. And you heard at the press conference after Nikisa Badarian, his advisor / business partner, said that they think the loss to Tommy was like the best thing that could have happened to him because they would have just kept going with their same routines, same people, all that stuff. So he kind of made the adjustments. I know it's like corny and a little bit cheesy to be like you learn more from losses than wins in combat sports, but it seems to be the case for Jake Paul. We got to kind of put it in context, right? He's only been boxing for like 4 years at this point. And one thing, you can dislike him as a person, his antics, that stuff, and the other, he does treat his preparation for the sport with respect. He spends the money, does it the right way, takes it seriously, brings in serious people. So that's one thing you can't necessarily knock him for. Does that mean he's going to become good enough that he can beat Canelo by 2026, as he predicted? Like, no, I don't think that's ever going to happen. But for who he is, like a novice boxer, I think you got to respect his improvement and the gains he's made in the time he's spent here.
All that perfectly said. Yes, I heard that Canelo thing. I think I spit my drink out. He needs to cool it with that. Everything else, I applaud him, man. YouTube star. Yes, him and his brother wrestled when they were younger. Great athletes. They do definitely surround themselves with the right people in this sport. I have respect for what they've done here. They make a ton of money, all that. But man, come on, stop with the Canelo stuff.
Well, if you don't like Jake Paul, you should absolutely want to see that fight, because he would get destroyed. So you should be hoping that happens.
True, but I don't even need to see it. I just pictured it right now, and that gave me the satisfaction. I mean, it's just, I don't know, whatever. He's the guy we're talking about. Well, that's fine. Big Ben 13 asking where Danny's at. We rotate the staff, man. We got a talented staff here, Big Ben, but he's been on the last few weeks. You'll catch him soon. He says Nate's smacking style didn't sit well with the boxing gloves on. Guys, could Nate have won this? Did it almost seem like once again, had he prepared a little bit more, taken it more serious, he could have won this? Even Nick was saying the same thing when he was talking to, I think it was the Zone group or whoever was covering this. That's what kind of sucks for me, man. Is like he comes up short in these big fights, and yes, he rolls out with more fans. He still makes a lot of money, but I think he could have been a bigger star and had a lot more money if he had just won a couple key fights.
Yeah, and I mean, he talked about it afterwards too, saying that he had an injury to his arm. So I'm not sure how much of a Diazism that is versus a reality or whatever. Again, tough guy to figure out. I think everybody involved kind of comes to that conclusion. But for me, I think Nate's age too. Like, I think there's a lot of different things when you look at him when he gets in there. Because I mean, to be honest, we don't see him that frequently either. Like seeing him once a year, and you kind of think like what Nate looked like the last time, and you try to compress the 3 fights together as if he was a guy that fought every 2 months. Like, I think age can catch up to him too. He's 38 now. His cardio obviously still hanging in there. I'm assuming he still does his triathlons and stuff like that. I just think that, sure, he could have come in and looked a little bit sharper, but he's also boxing and he's not a boxer. So it's a lot going on there, right?
Mm-hmm. All right, guys. One last thing here, and then we'll move on. What really is next for Diaz? What really you guys think happens here? Does he just go back to MMA, sign with the UFC? He tickled, that little itch he had for boxing, made some money, and that's it? Or what do you think? Because you're right. Father Time is going to catch up to him pretty soon if it hasn't already. What do you guys think you see him next? We'll go really quick around the horn, Mike Bond.
I don't know. I think there's a decent chance we get this rematch in MMA. Like, I think it is possible. Jake Paul seemed to be taking it seriously. He said he wants to make this happen. He's under contract with PFL. If he plans on actually doing that, this seems like a pretty good fit for him. And Nate made it pretty clear, I think, at the press conference. He said, getting this rematch is all that matters to me at this point. And you wonder what the UFC's interest level is in him at this point. If this, as Farah alluded to earlier, like damaged his value at all in their eyes. I mean, I can't imagine they're offering him the exact same money to fight whomever is maybe they did before this loss. I don't know. Maybe there's a way to prove he's an even bigger draw after this. I can't say for sure, but yeah, it's tough. I think there is options for him, but I feel like he's going to want that Jake Paul fight back in some facet again. And I think they'll see the business that they did together on Saturday, and it'll make sense for everyone involved.
Mike, you think PFL has to co-promote? Will Nate actually don the PFL gear and be an official PFL fighter, you think? Because he seems like he retains some loyalty to the UFC. So how does this happen if it happens with the PFL involved somehow, or does it?
I'm sure have to be a co-promotion of some kind. What that would look like, I don't know. Whether it's just like, something on the branding, PFL and Real Fighting present this fight, this event, if he has a patch on his shorts, whatever, stuff on the cage. There's ways you can do this. And I think PFL would be very open to doing something like this, because why wouldn't they? I mean, they're desperate for a fight of this magnitude. They should move mountains and do whatever they need if they could get a Nate Diaz fight under their banner in their pay-per-view division or whatever. Like, this would be huge. If you get this fight, maybe Francis Ngannou's debut on the same card, Kayla Harrison. I don't know how that would work if they're splitting revenue between all these different people as they claim with their pay-per-view things, but you can figure that stuff out later. They should do everything they can to make this happen, no matter what compromises they'd have to make for Nate.
All right, Fada, where do you want to see Nate Diaz next? You determine his career. Let's see.
Well, that's the thing, because what's on the table for him if he were to go back to the UFC? You've got Dustin Poirier or potentially Conor McGregor, who's not back in the USADA testing pool, who we don't know if he's going to fight Michael Chandler. We don't know what he's going to do. I don't know. Like I said, after this Jake Paul, I mean, Dustin Poirier is coming off of a loss, but he looked decent. He looked good. It's not like I felt like Dustin Poirier looked like a different version of himself. He's still Dustin Poirier. He's still a guy that was on the cusp of a title fight. How intrigued would people be to see Poirier versus Diaz after we saw Diaz, box Jake Paul? So I don't know. I mean, like Mike was saying, I don't see that being the worst path in the world. It's just the only complication is he seems to be loyal to the UFC, and obviously UFC are known not to co-promote, so they would just have to figure that part out. But maybe it's not the worst thing in the world for him to look at a Jake Paul rematch. I don't want to really see it in boxing. I don't know if that's the direction they'd go, but in MMA, if it were to be possible, I think that would pique my interest probably more than a Dustin Poirier fight. But Conor McGregor trilogy, yes, I'd want to see that, because we forget, Conor's coming off of that injury. Anderson Silva was never the same when he came back from that injury. Chris Weidman we're about to see on August 19th, so we don't even know what version of Conor we're getting. So I'd be interested in a Conor-Nate trilogy, but with all the question marks around Conor McGregor, maybe Dustin Poirier would be more on the table for him with a UFC return, and I don't know how much I want to see that fight after watching him box Jake Paul. So why not Jake Paul in MMA?
All right, I think these two covered it enough, Nolan. I won't throw that on you. But if you have something to share, go ahead. But I want to throw something at you. It got kind of ugly on social media afterwards with what Conor McSwaggerjacker always chiming in when there's a big fight. First he kind of went after Diaz, kind of critiquing, that whole point and move, and this is what I would do. And then, of course, Jake Paul comes in, he gets involved, and he's obviously telling Conor, clean your act up. Conor's opining on his act, which I don't even want to say what he said. But what did you think of all the fallout on Saturday night?
Very typical. I think overall, not surprising. I think Conor McGregor needs to insert himself into a lot of conversations that go on, or he takes it upon himself to do so. I don't know how much he needs to, but I mean, it's a Diaz fight. He has history with Diaz. McGregor likes to go on Twitter, say outrageous things, it seems like, in the moment. We've seen him even do it with people that he has no involvement with at all. So very not surprised, considering both of his histories with Jake Paul through the media and with Nate Diaz in their two fights and everything that they've been through. So not surprised. I mean, again, I'm sure we'll be here 2 years from now talking about a trilogy again, but it seems like it's something that Diaz is open to in the future. It seems like something the UFC is open to in the future, and it seems like something Conor's open to in the future. So, and I think, honestly, all of us would be excited to see it. So hopefully it happens. As far as the Conor trash talk goes, I mean, not surprised.
Mm-hmm. This has been a long topic. I'll give you guys a final chance. You want to weigh in on Conor and Jake Paul's little battle there on social media?
I'm less interested in the Jake Paul Conor stuff and just Conor's comments on Nate Diaz, right? He was very critical, but basically saying, like, you kind of hinted towards earlier, George, like with the antics and the walking away. He said, you're pointing, like you could have beat Leon Edwards more or less, but you decided to mess around. Like, is there validity to that stuff? Obviously that's what Nate Diaz is beloved for, is these moments that he provides. But if he fought differently, if he had maybe his head in the game a little more, could he be winning more fights? Is this the best he can do with his style, right? Like, he probably knows himself better than anyone else, right? And what he's capable of in there. So is it fair? Is it unfair? I did think that was at least a semi-interesting and somewhat fair take by Conor to a degree. If you kind of look at him, because he's probably like, damn, man, like if you had beat Jake Paul, which maybe he watched that fight and thought there was an avenue for Nate, how much bigger does that make our trilogy? And now, like, you keep losing, does the UFC even want you back to the same degree? Is it going to be a struggle with the negotiation? I'm sure he's thinking of all these things, and I'm sure there's more difficulties at this point trying to get Conor into a fight that there would be Nate Diaz. But yeah, I thought that was at least, maybe not the correct messenger, but the message was intriguing. I thought at least it made me think.